Hello and welcome to the Microsoft Project 101 training presented by the SDD Scheduling Team. In this training, we plan on covering the fundamental basics of Microsoft Project so any end user could open up a project file, comprehend what's in that file, work with the data in that file, and learn to develop some high-level reports that can be easily saved as a PDF and then distributed to a list of your choosing. Now, before we actually begin with the training, I would like to present you with the syllabus, which is basically the topics that we'll be covering in this training. We do begin with the basic navigation, and we go into some of the best practices when we talk about auto versus manual scheduling. So we do jump around a little bit, but we try to keep it concise and easily consumable. Towards the end of our training, we will construct an actual schedule from scratch, so we'll see what that looks like. And then we're going to finalize our training with a baselining of the schedule and a print preview so you can see what a PDF report looks like. Now, all the documents that you see on this training will be provided to you in soft copy format. If you have not received it, please feel free to reach out to any member of the SDD Scheduling Team and we'll be happy to provide that to you. Now, moving right through our syllabus, we find ourselves on the assignment page, which this page gives you the opportunity to test your knowledge gaps that you have in Microsoft Project. So all the topics that we covered in this training, you can actually reenact them here on this assignment sheet and identify those pieces where you still need some assistance. Always feel welcome to reach out to any member of the SDD Scheduling Team to receive additional support in any areas that you feel you need. Moving on to the next two pages, you'll notice that these are dubbed the cheat sheets. Basically, when you go into Microsoft Project, you go to File and then Options. You're able to enable the best practices for dynamic scheduling. The only thing that I want to mention at this point about the cheat sheet is that there is a setting here. The scheduling options for this project currently says Project 1, and you can see here Scheduler Options Project 1. Whenever you see this Project 1, what you actually want to switch that over to is All New Projects. When we go into the options in the menu, we will actually see that and we'll change it ourselves. So let's jump right into the options by opening a blank Microsoft Project file. I do want to focus on one setting in particular, which is the new task created auto scheduled in the options. I will allow you all to take the additional time needed for you to go to the second tab in advance and ensure that each of these hash marks are covered and accounted for. So without further ado, I will open up a blank Microsoft Project file by going to my Start menu and selecting Project 2013. Now, some of you may be wondering, well, I have Microsoft Project 2010 or even 2007. Will anything that I learned in this training apply to those earlier versions? And the answer is yes, absolutely. Most, if not all, of what you learn in this training will be directly applicable to the earlier versions of Microsoft Project. So here is 2013. I'm going to go ahead and open up a blank project by selecting it. And I have a project information window that pops up. Now, some of your versions may or may not have this information window pop up by default. It's simply a setting in the options. So we want to go focus on that auto scheduled option. So what we will do is hit OK here. Now I want you to notice on the bottom, I have a little bubble that popped up. New tasks are created in auto-scheduled mode. Now because I've done the options cheat sheet numerous times, Microsoft Project actually holds that setting for me. I don't have to re-enable it each time. What I would like to demonstrate though is where that option is so that you can see where to change it. So I'm going to go to File and then I'll go to Options. So once I have the project options window open, I'll switch over to the schedule tab, and here I can find that my new tasks are created in auto scheduled mode. Now there's two versions here, manual and auto scheduled. Before I actually go into them, what I want to discuss is that you just want to schedule this to auto scheduled. Wherever you have the drop down for project 1, what you actually want to select it and switch it over to is all new projects. So I'm just doing that very quickly here for all new projects. And I'll just hit OK. Now, go ahead and take the time necessary to look through your cheat sheet and ensure that all of your options match what's on that cheat sheet. So now that we've set up our Microsoft Project options, we can jump right into the basic navigation. I'd like to begin by explaining this left side and how it's very similar to Microsoft Excel, whereby I can come in here and just enter some information under one of the columns and it shows up just like it would on Excel. Now, it differs in that these columns that we have up here may or may not have specific roles or functions within Microsoft Project. In Excel, you can simply add in any kind of text or verbiage that you'd like in there without having any issues. And these columns are a little bit different as they all have a different purpose. And we'll jump into that a little bit later. For now, suffice to know that they each have their own roles and that they each have a unique purpose. The Gantt chart literally is just a visual representation of the data that you have on the left side. So in other words, if I have an activity here going from 9/13/17 to 9/13/17, it's a 1-day duration, and you can see here, based off our timeline, that it's capturing that 1 day. If I were to change this to 5 days, which in Microsoft Project is 1 work week, it would come out to that full 5 days. Now notice here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I didn't count Saturday and Sunday because Microsoft Project, by default, treats Saturdays and Sundays as non-working days. Now there are ways to tell Microsoft Project to treat Saturdays and Sundays as working days, and we do that with our calendar functionality, which we cover a little bit later. So now that we have a good understanding of the left side and the right side, we can talk a little bit about the timeline. And actually very briefly, because the timeline is covered in more detail in Microsoft Project 201 training. For the purposes of this training, however, I'd like to always cover and at least talk to the timeline at a high level, explaining that it is simply a way for you to add any items of interest from your schedule to a timeline very easily. So let's say, for example, I had this summary task and I wanted to add it to that timeline. I could just right click and add to the timeline. And sure enough, there's my summary task spanning over the entire timeline. For now, I'm going to just go ahead and hide this timeline as it's going to give me more real estate on my screen. I can do that one of two ways. I can right click this white area and uncheck Show Timeline. Now I'm going to select Control Z on my keyboard to undo to show you a different way. So the other way to do this is to go to your View tab and then to simply unselect the Timeline checkbox. Now to run briefly through the tabs up here, we have our File tab, we have our Task tab, Resource, Report, Project, View, and Format. If you have any version earlier than 2013, it's likely you won't have this Report tab. That's quite alright, as the earlier versions of Microsoft Project still had out-of-the-box reporting capability, just not as sophisticated as the ones that come with 2013. Not to worry though, the SDD Scheduling Team is happy to take on any custom reporting requests or requirements for reports and to develop those custom reports for you. All of those custom reports have the ability to be saved so that we don't have to recreate the wheel each time. We can simply click a couple of buttons and receive the data elements that we were looking for. Within each of these tabs, what you'll find is the ribbon. So what I'm circling around right now is the ribbon for the Task tab. In that Task ribbon, we would find different functions and capabilities to modify tasks within our schedule. So if I wanted to, for example, highlight this cell in yellow, I could do that under the Task ribbon right here. To bring it back, I'll just simply click it to white. It also gives me capability to link the selected tasks, do things like mark on track, and a number of other features and functions. Under the Resource tab, you'll be able to assign resources to specific activities. If you are planning on resource and cost loading a schedule, this would be the place to do it. Moving forward to the Reporting tab we talked about briefly already, that is a 2013 functionality where you do have some nice reports. But as we mentioned before, always reach out to us to create those custom reports that are going to be more useful for you. In the Project tab, you're going to have functions to change your project information, which we can jump into real quick. So the project information will actually give you your start date or your finish date. In other words, this is the day the first activity in your project should begin, or the final day that your project would end on. Most of the SDD projects you'll find are from the project start date. Our current date is taking the system date, and the status date is set to NA currently. Reason being is because we have not specified what that status date is. Calendar standard. And we'll hit OK here. The other thing I want to point out from the project ribbon is our change working time. When I click on this, I'll notice that it's completely blank. What's really nice about change working time is it allows the SDD schedulers to more effectively plan for things like government holidays. Since we work on the government holiday calendar, we're able to go to opm.gov and attain all the federal holidays through, I believe, 2020. And so to check that, all I have to do is choose my drop-down menu and select the government project calendar. You can see here that I have the holidays listed out through 2020. Now what's nice about Microsoft Project is I don't have to recreate the wheel each time I want to implement this calendar in a schedule. All I have to do is use a function called the organizer, which allows me to move things like calendars, views, tables, filters, even custom fields from one schedule to another schedule. Now that we know we have our government holidays active and ready, let's go ahead and test one and see how it works. To demonstrate, I will go to the July 4th of 2018 Independence Day holiday. I'll select OK. And to demonstrate that, I'll change the summary task to July 3rd of 2018. Now this is typically a practice that I wouldn't recommend because the best way to enter in dates in a Microsoft Project file is through your dependencies, and we'll go into much more detail about that in a little bit. For now, I'm going to do a bad practice by typing in the date here of that July 3rd, 2018. I'm going to change my duration to 1 day for the demonstration. Since we have 7/3/18 and it's a 1 day duration, if I were to change it to 2 days, I would expect it to end on 7/5/18. Reason being that we have the government holiday of Independence Day on 7/4/18. So although if it were a normal activity and it wasn't on a holiday, I would actually expect a 2 day duration to end on 7/4/18. But because that holiday is in place, I expect it to end on 7/5. So let's take a look at what that looks like. I can either come in here and hit the up arrow to make it go to 2 days, and then I can select enter on my keyboard. And sure enough, there it goes, out to 7/5. Now if I do a quick Control Z to undo, I can show you the other way to enter in 2 days. It's simply having the cell highlighted, and then I can go to my number pad and type in the number 2. I don't have to type in D or days. I can just type in the number 2 and hit enter, and it does the same thing for me. Automatically populates days. So that's a very quick demonstration of how the holidays work using Independence Day as an example. So now that we've covered the change working time, we can jump right into the View tab. From the View tab, you'll have access to a number of functions and features that allow you to modify what you see on the left side of your Microsoft Project file over here. From the Formatting tab, you'll find a different set of functions that will allow you to change things like your Gantt chart colors and different formatting features. These are very similar to other features that you find in other Microsoft Office products. So with that, now you have a relatively good understanding of where things are in Microsoft Project. Over here on the left side, we know that this is where we enter our data, and this is where we enter all of our tasks, along with dependencies and really the meat and potatoes of Microsoft Project. On the right side, we're going to have a visual representation of the data that we have on the left side. It's going to come in Gantt chart format. So if I were to scroll over to 2018, where we are in the schedule here, you would see the 7/3 to 7/5 dates show up. So it's always reflecting both sides. Now notice when I hover over the center, I have this double-sided arrow with 2 lines. I can left click and hold, and now I can drag this to wherever I want. If I want to see more of my Gantt chart, I certainly can. And if I want to see more of my data entry side, I can see more of that as well. For the purposes of this training, I'm going to go ahead and hide away the Gantt chart. Now, before we move past the basic navigation portion of this training, I would like for you to add the entry bar. On products like Microsoft Excel, the entry bar is a standard feature and it's not something that you have to option. However, with Microsoft Project, you do. So simply go to File and then Options, and then you can go to your Display tab and then just have the entry bar selected down here under Show These Elements and select OK. You'll realize very shortly, once you start playing with your dependencies in your Microsoft Project file, that the entry bar becomes very useful and handy. So taking a quick jump right back into our topics, we have auto versus manual scheduling up next. Now, a lot of what I talk about in this Microsoft Project training are the best practices of schedule management. We derive these best practices from the Government Accountability Office's 10 best practices. One of those best practices is auto versus manual scheduling. To explain the difference, I usually like to demonstrate, but basically at a high level, automatic scheduling enables Microsoft Project scheduling engine. Manually scheduling activities completely does away with that scheduling engine altogether and says, I don't care about dependencies, I don't care about what constraints are on this activity, I'm just going to put in a manual date and it's not going to affect anything else in my schedule. Now this can be very problematic because when you have changes occur in a schedule, you want to see what the impacts are. So when you have a manually scheduled activity, you're actually taking away from your dynamic capability and your what-if analysis when it comes to scheduling. So I'd like to actually demonstrate that for you by going to our Microsoft Project file. And if we go to our task mode column, you can actually see, if you hover over it, it says automatically scheduled task. And as you know, through our project cheat sheet, we were asked to enable all the best settings, including automatically scheduled activities for new tasks. So when I entered in the word summary under my task name, it automatically created a line item for me, and it automatically made it auto schedule. Now if I were to enter another line item, let's do task activity 1, and I were to say that this is actually a manually scheduled task, it would come up with a blue pin. Now what I'd like to show is the difference between an auto task and a manual task. So to do that, I want to first show you what the right way is. So I'm actually going to bring in a new column. I can left click here and type successors. And just as easily, I could have right clicked here and inserted a column and call it successors. You really have the option to do whichever way you want. In addition to those two options, you can actually double left click one of the columns. If you just simply want to overwrite one, you can just do that. And now I have 3 successor columns when I really only need 1. So I'm going to go ahead and highlight these 2, and I can either right click and hide the columns, or I can have those 2 columns highlighted just as they are, and I can select delete on my keyboard. Now before I move forward, I know some folks get anxiety from having things deleted from their keyboard. So what I want to demonstrate very quickly is that if I were to have a column like notes, and I were to enter in data into the notes column, what would happen is it's stored in that column. It's stored in that cell where I've entered it. If I were to come in here and select hide column, the note is still there, right? You can see in my indicators column right here, it says notes, data still there. But if I were to bring that column back, my notes, I can see the data still there. If I wanted to delete the information that's in the column, there's 1 of 2 ways that I can do that. If I want to delete the singular cell, I can just click on the cell and select delete on my keyboard, and it does away with the note. And I'll hit Control Z to undo. If I want to delete everything that was in this column, for example, I could highlight by left clicking the header, and that would highlight the entire column effectively, and then I could hit Control, I could hold Control that is, and then select delete. And what that would do is effectively delete everything that's in there. So the difference between deleting and hiding is a matter of holding control. So it's almost a fail-safe in place. You can't delete the content that's in your schedule unless you specifically ask it to by holding control. So now that we've gone off that tangent, we can get back on topic. So we were talking about manual versus automatically scheduled activities. Now we know that these two are automatically scheduled because they have that blue rectangle with the gray arrow pointing to the right, and it's not a blue pin. Now we have our two columns here for logic, /dependencies, / your network. So now here we have our two columns where you can enter your dependencies, your predecessors and your successors. Predecessors are activities that occur before the line item you're referencing, and successors are activities that occur after the line item you're referencing. So to give an example, my successor to row 1 would be row 2, would it not? If it were in chronological order, my successor would definitely be row 2. So I'm simply going to type in the number 2 here. I haven't hit enter yet. Before I hit enter, I want us to understand, or at least guess, what the task activity 1 date should begin at after I've set this dependency. Due to the fact that row 1 is completing on 7/5/18, I would suspect that task activity 1 would begin directly the day after. And the reason I would suspect that is because by default, Microsoft Project treats any dependency as a finish to start relationship unless you specify otherwise. What I mean by finish to start is it's a standard chronological relationship. Activity A happens and then B can begin. So in this case, when I type in the number 2, it's defaulting to that finish to start relationship, a chronological relationship. So I would expect task activity 1 to begin on 7/6/18. So let's hit enter and see what occurs. And here it is, the 7/6/18. Now I want to demonstrate what the opposite of that scenario is using a manually scheduled activity. Using a manually scheduled activity will actually hinder your ability to see the accurate dates or the impacts of changes occurring in your schedule. So I want to demonstrate that for you by doing a Control-Z, which is undo. Okay, so that's removed my successor here. I'm going to go to my task mode column and I'm going to select a manually scheduled. Okay, so that's made my little blue pin show up here. And I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to enter the number 2 in my successors column and I'll hit enter. And what you see are no changes to the dates for your start and finish date. So it now no longer cares about the dependency I've put in place here. And it's saying, well, because you specified that 9/13/17 date before, that's what we're going to leave it at until you tell me otherwise. But it is nice enough, it'll tell you with these little red squigglies that it is a manually scheduled activity, and based off the network logic that we have set up, it's not reflecting the actuals. So this is it's a nice way for Microsoft Project to communicate with us about a potential issue. Safe to say, the best practice in Microsoft Project for auto versus manual is 100% of the time use automatically scheduled. The reason being is because you want to enable that scheduling engine to show you those impacts when changes occur in your schedule. So jumping back into our syllabus, we can see our next topic is the constraint type. So we're going to jump right into that by opening up a new column, and we're going to call that constraint type. Alright. And now we can see that it's actually listed 2 different constraints out for each of these activities. Now, if you can recall, when we opened up the summary task, it defaulted to a certain date. And more than likely, it defaulted to the project start date, which, in my opinion, is probably 9/13/17. Let's take a look at how we can verify that. If I go to the Project tab, and then within the ribbon, I find the Project Information window, here's my project start date. So any activity that I don't assign specifically a predecessor to, it will default to this date. 9/13/17. So now that I know that that would have been the default date here, because it does not have a predecessor, I know that someone, myself, came in here and actually made the modification to this date. And I can see that immediately created a constraint type of start note earlier then. So if I were to take this off and make this as soon as possible, this date I would expect to actually default back to this project start date, which is 9/13/17. Now let me switch that to as soon as possible, and indeed there it has changed that date. So to explain the different constraint types, I want to list them out for you. Here they are. By hitting that drop down, you get to see what they all are. Your top 2 are your flexible constraints. They are the 2 that you're going to use most often, And in fact, as late as possible, you probably won't use too often because that's when you're scheduling from a project finish date. And from what we heard earlier, most of our schedules are from the start date. These two in the middle, the must start on and must finish on, are what we call inflexible or hard constraints. These are basically like manually scheduled activities. If I put a hard constraint on a task, that task, regardless of the dependencies around it, will not budge when you have a change occur. So we typically don't recommend these. And the ones down here below, start no later than, start no earlier than, finish no later than, or finish no earlier than, are semi-flexible constraints. They're not necessarily the worst thing in the schedule. However, they still create constraints in the schedule that doesn't allow for dynamic change to occur. So we would still advise against using these. Now we understand in some situations the use of a constraint is valid. Certain circumstances would call for that. An example of this would be an external activity in your schedule. So if you are dependent on an external organization providing something to you, then that really is out of your control and it's an external dependency. In those cases, because nothing else is driving it in your schedule, you can use something like a constraint. So I could come in here, for example, if I knew that my task activity 1 actually began on, let's say, 9/21, and only because an external party was going to send me documentation, for example, I could come in here and switch this over to 9/21. Now that hasn't changed my constraint type because I have a task mode of manually scheduled. So let me demonstrate that again. Let me hit Control Z to undo, and I'm actually going to make this automatically schedule. Now I'm going to come back in here and I'm going to click on that date again, 9/21. So now my planning wizard has come up with, you move task activity 1 away from summary and 2 tasks are linked. As a result, the link between the tasks will not drive the start of the later task. So this is a great notification that Microsoft Project is warning us about, because if you look at our dependencies, I'm saying that the successor to row 1 is row 2, and based off my manual input, now keep in mind this is a bad practice that I'm doing. We are not recommending to change the constraint type to anything else. Although this is just an example. Because I've come in here and I have my dependencies in place, it's giving me this warning that the date that I'm punching in manually is going to be different than the date based off the dependency I've built. So what I'm going to do is read through these options and select the best one. In this case, I will remove the link because it doesn't matter. Once I've removed that link, what we see here is start no earlier than, and that's a constraint type that may or may not make sense in your schedule. There are some valid situations, but it's good to use as soon as possible, as often as you can, because that's what's going to enable that scheduling engine to continue working as well as it can. So now that we have a good idea of what our constraint types can do for us, we can jump right into our indicators column. The indicators column actually assists us by visually showing us a graphical representation of some information it wants to tell us about any particular task activity. So if I'm looking at row 2, for example, because I have a constraint type of start no earlier than, we know that that's not the default of as soon as possible. Microsoft Project wants to notify us by having this little calendar widget. It's a calendar graphical icon. And here you can see it start no earlier than constraint on 9/21. And what's particularly useful about the indicators column is that it's a relatively small column. Well, you can make it as big as you like, honestly, but I like to keep it nice and small. But when I go ahead and hide columns that I don't need, for example, the constraint type column, it still tells me that it has a constraint set there. In addition, it will tell me a number of other pertinent information that it wants to tell me. Let's say, for example, I had a note in here. What would actually show up is a little yellow notepad, and when I hover over it, it'll actually tell me what's in that note. So that can be very useful if you have a large schedule and you don't want to open up these columns. Sometimes you may also see little red people in the indicators column. That would indicate that you have over-allocated resources in your schedule. I will give a brief example of a feature in Microsoft Project that I think is very helpful. It's called the deadline feature, and it's highlighted in the indicator column. So now I'm going to go into an example of how to use an alternative method to a hard constraint. This method is using the deadline functionality of Microsoft Project. So to demonstrate that, I will begin by opening up Task Activity 1 by double left clicking the task name. Now I could click on any one of these. Let's say I wanted to click on the Notes column. Under row 2, I could do that and it would still do the same thing. It's going to bring up my task information window. Now once this is up, I will click on the Advanced tab, and then over here I will see a section for deadline, and by default it's NA. Let's come in here and switch this date to, let's say, 9/25 of 17. And let's switch our constraint type back to as soon as possible. So what we're doing is a couple of different things here. Remember, we had a constraint type of start no earlier than. Because we're switching it back to as soon as possible, it's going to remove that start no earlier than constraint type completely. And now we're going to have a deadline of 9/25/17. So let me go ahead and hit OK. So now we have our constraint type back to as soon as possible. We can verify that by opening up the constraint type column again. And here we are, as soon as possible. But to keep in mind, what we're testing here is the deadline functionality. And this is as an alternative to using a hard constraint. Because I could come in here and say that it must finish on 9/25. I could do that, but that's going to constrain my schedule and it's not going to allow for dynamic change. So how can I have Microsoft Project still notify me of when I'm going to miss that deadline without using a hard constraint? So when I go into that Advanced tab and we have that deadline set to 9/25, just verifying very quickly here, I'll hit OK. What I'm going to do is I'm going to build the logic to this row 2, right? So my successor to row 1 is row 2. I'll just enter in the number 2 in the successor column and select enter. And this immediately has my row 2 beginning after row 1 on 9/15. So to test the deadline functionality, what we can do is actually increase the duration or push to the right this summary activity on row 1. So I will switch this duration to, let's go for 15 days. And it's past my 9/25 date. In my indicators column, I now have a red warning that tells me this task goes past its deadline on 9/25/17. So although I don't have my must finish on constraint, I'm still getting notified by Microsoft Project that this activity is going past its deadline date. And guess what? I get that dynamic change, because if something does get pushed to the right, I still want to see the impact regardless of whether or not it's something I want to deal with. I get to see that impact. So by having that deadline set, we're able to see that dynamic change in our network when changes occur. I like to go through this example with the deadline because it provides an excellent alternative to using a hard constraint or a semi-flexible constraint. I see that oftentimes in schedules, and the impact in terms of hindering dynamic change is substantial. So what we always recommend is to use alternatives when possible. Use your network logic, which we're going to go into a lot more detail when we're actually building the schedule, and to use things like deadlines. Always feel free to work with your PMO schedulers to understand a little bit better how to use different functionality to still get the type of information that you want out of your schedule without having to impact that dynamic change. Jumping right back into our syllabus, we can see our next topic is going to be the customized toolbar topic. This is a very useful topic for anyone who will be using Microsoft Project often. One of the things that I like about all Microsoft Office products is that you have the ability to customize a toolbar. Now, I actually want to begin the discussion on the toolbar in Microsoft Word because, as I just mentioned, each Microsoft Office product has a toolbar, and the functionality is similar across each of the products, so you can really customize it to your liking. By default, you'll notice up here is the toolbar. So I have save, save as, undo, and a number of other default features that come on there. What I can do is select this drop-down menu and change this to show below the ribbon, which is what I'm going to demonstrate in Microsoft Project, but just to show you, it can be done in all the other Microsoft products. So we'll switch now to the project file. Here it is. And what you can see is I have a toolbar as well, but it's completely built out and it's actually showing below the ribbon. So recall on the Word file, it was up here, and now I have the option to move it above the ribbon. So I can do it either above or below. I'm going to select below because it's more convenient for me to use as a scheduler. The functions that I have on my toolbar are specific to my usage, and they are the functions that I use most often. So obviously what you would want to do is customize your toolbar to your own preferences. You would find the functions, features in Microsoft Project within each of these task tabs. You'll find within the ribbon each function that you really want to use on a recurring basis. So the toolbar can be very useful. Instead of having to go into each one of these tabs, you can just put it here on a very quick access toolbar. So I'm going to go through the ones that I have on my toolbar, and you can feel free to add those to yours if you'd like. If not, please feel free to go through each of the ribbons and pick and choose what you think is pertinent. I will explain to you, or at least I will advise what I think are the best ones to have as a beginner. So when I go to this drop down again, I'm going to select more commands. Now that I'm under the quick access toolbar in my project options, I have the option to select from popular commands or from all commands, and that's the one I'm going to bring up. When I have all commands open, I can see all the features and functions that are found within the ribbon up here. On my own toolbar, these are the options that I have. So I have organizer, options, save as, print preview, wrap text. I have a number of items on here. The ones that I would like for you to add onto your toolbar are going to be the following. You're already going to have save and save as. I would like for you to add the wrap text. Please add outdent task, indent task. Go ahead and add link the selected tasks. Go ahead and add delete row. Go ahead and select show outline. Now this show outline will be the option with the plus and the minus arrow. There's a number of show outlines when we actually go to it, and this is in alphabetical order. Unfortunately, you can't start typing for it to search for you. You will just have to find it. When you go to show outline, there's going to be a number of options, obviously here. Go ahead and just select the one with the plus and the minus. And once you've completed all that, you can hit OK. And of course, you can arrange them in any order that you want with this up and down arrow. I'm going to select OK here. And then you'll have your quick access toolbar. Now before we move forward, I want to show you this show outline level. So the show outline level is very useful in a project schedule that's already developed, that has a number of line items and has hierarchy built into it. For the purposes of this demonstration, I'm going to open up an IMS. Here's the IMS. This is an older IMS, and what you can see is as I'm scrolling through, it can be rather difficult to understand where we are. Although I can see some summary lines, if I were to scroll all the way to the bottom of the schedule, I can see it's a 3,200 line schedule. It's a pretty large schedule. So for me to be able to consume the information here or to pull out elements that are pertinent to me may be challenging. So the best way to do this, to really have a good comprehension, is to use the outline level. So I'm going to go to my toolbar, have that plus and minus arrow, and I'm going to select level 1. Now notice I have 9 levels available to me. I'll select level 1. Now what happens when I do that, it looks like my schedule went away. What I'm going to do is hold Control and Home, and it's going to take me to the top of my schedule. Whenever I collapse the schedule, Microsoft Project tends to do that. So I can see that on my outline level 1, it is the MHS ICD-10 implementation schedule. So what I'll do is now I'll go to outline level 2, and I'll see what we have on there. Okay, so now I can see it's broken out by 3 major summaries: the program management, centrally managed systems, and service managed systems. Let's go a little bit further. Let's take it to level 3. When I go to level 3, now I can see, okay, now the program management's broken out. And if I were caring only about a particular system, I could select the one that I wanted here. Let's say, for example, I was interested in the M2. I could come in here and simply look at what is pertinent to me and pull the information that I need and move forward with it. So this is an excellent way that you can use to decompose the information that you have in a larger IMS. So definitely use this when you need. It can come in very handy. We're going to jump right back into our syllabus very quickly to see what our next topic is, and it looks like constructing a schedule is coming up next. This happens to be my favorite part of the training because we actually get to build a schedule from scratch, and I get to share with you my best practice of how to do that, or at least conceptualize how to build a schedule even before you build it in Microsoft Project. And to demonstrate that, I will show you our work breakdown structure. Now, a work breakdown structure is defined as the decomposition of a larger work effort into more discrete work packages. So the WBS allows us to see what will actually be required to complete larger efforts. This is usually a foundation for a Microsoft project file because the WBS tends to capture the entire scope of work, which a Microsoft project schedule should be doing just that. I like to use the wedding example because it's simple enough and most people understand what is involved with the wedding. So I'm going to transpose this hierarchical structure into Microsoft Project, and I'm going to show you how. Now, if you recall our discussion on the show outline levels, we're going to be able to map between our WBS and our Microsoft Project schedule using that outline level. So with our first click here, we see that wedding is on our outline level 1. If we click again, we'll see that guests, entertainment, and food are on our outline level 2. Now the way that this would read is your wedding is comprised of 3 main phases: guest phase, entertainment phase, and the food phase. Each of these phases have discrete work packages beneath them. So in other words, your green activities down here are part of your outline level 3, and they are the work packages required to complete those phases. So to look at guests, for guests to be 100% complete, I'd have to have select guests and deliver invitations complete for me to say that the guest phase is complete. And then once I have select venue and hire wedding singer complete, entertainment is complete. Once I have research vendors and select entrees complete, I'll have my food phase complete. And guess what? Once I have my guests, my entertainment, and my food phases all complete, then my wedding in its entirety has been completed as well. One thing to note, before we move forward, the summary tasks, or in other words, parent tasks, end up being boldface in Microsoft Project by default. And you'll notice I have dark outlines around all of my summary tasks on outline level 1 and level 2, and the reason being is because to signify that summary tasks are boldface in Microsoft Project. As where if you look at the discrete tasks down here, the subtasks or the child tasks, they end up as non-boldface in Microsoft Project. Another thing to note is that our summary tasks are portrayed as nouns, and our child tasks always have a verb associated with them. This better enables the viewer of the schedule to understand what activity is occurring and what action is being taken. So now that we have an idea of our work breakdown structure, we're going to begin transposing this data into a Microsoft Project file. To do that, I'm going to go back to my project file that we were working on. And I will begin by actually deleting the information that we have in there. So I'm going to go to my toolbar, and in my toolbar I have an option called delete row, so I'll go ahead and click that, and now I have my schedule open. For me, it's easier to have on one screen that work breakdown structure and on another screen the Microsoft Project file. So I'm going to go ahead and begin by typing out wedding under my task name column, and then I'll type out my subsequent summary lines, which are going to be guests, entertainment, and food. Now you may be asking, what about the discrete tasks? We're going to add them in now. To add in the 2 activities under guests, we'll simply select the 2 cells right below guests. Now we have 2 options to add tasks here. I can simply right click the selection and select insert task. That's one method. I'll select Control Z on my keyboard to undo, and I'll show you the second method. Now, having the same selection here, I can go to my Task tab, and then I have an icon here for Task. It's a drop down, and I can just select Task right here, and it'll add those two tasks for me. Those two tasks were select guests and deliver invitations. Underneath entertainment, we had two tasks as well, so I'll highlight the two cells right below entertainment, and I will do the opposite method, which is to right click and insert task. The two activities were select venue and hire wedding singer. And then under food, we don't have to add tasks because they're already open for us and we can just start typing. So we had research vendors and select entrees. Now that we technically have the entire scope of our sample project from the WBS in our Microsoft project schedule, we can begin to build the hierarchy, which will delineate our parent and child activities. Because I know that everything from guests down to select entrees are technically children tasks to the wedding, I'm going to create that hierarchy first. By highlighting rows 2 through 10, now I can go ahead and indent them. So to do that, there's two methods. I'll show you the first method. Under the Task tab, you can go ahead and find your indent task. You may also have this on your toolbar. The indent task is an icon with a green arrow going to the right. I can just click on it and it automatically pushes these to the right for me, creating that hierarchy. So these are now children to the wedding, which notice wedding became boldface. This entire row became boldface because it's now a summary task or a parent task. Go ahead and hit Control Z to undo. The alternate method is if you actually hover your mouse over any of the first two letters of any of the activities you want to move, you'll see this double-sided arrow. When you see that, you can left click and hold and drag to where you want. Notice it will actually show you where it's going to fall. And I'm just going to push it out to the right there. Now that can take some time getting used to using that feature versus the indent and outdent functionality. It's up to you which way you want to move forward, depending on what your comfort level is with each of the methods. There is no wrong or right within Microsoft Project. The next thing that we want to do is build the hierarchy for the children themselves. So I know that select guests and deliver invitations are subtasks to the guests. So I can easily come over here and hover over the two first letters of either one of these, left click and hold, and then drag to the right. And then I've created that. I can do the same with select venue and hire wedding singer. This time I'll do the indent. Okay. Then there's research vendors and select entrees. I'll go ahead and move them over to the right. Now there is a quicker way to do this. I'm going to hit Control Z twice and 3 times. I could simply select these and then hold Control on my keyboard, select these, and then continue holding Control and select the final. I'm just going to go ahead and indent them all. Just like that. So I could have done it all in one. So it's up to you again to take a look at these different methods and choose the one that's best for you. Building the hierarchy in a schedule is very important to understand what your parent and children task relationship are. One thing to note is that your children will always roll up to that summary level or that parent level. Any changes that occur in your schedule, they should occur on the child level, as the parent will always reflect those changes. How can we verify very quickly before we move forward that the outline levels are indeed working properly? I could click on Add New Column, bring in a new column called Outline Level. And sure enough, there's my outline level 1, 2s, and my 3s. They are verified for me there. Similarly, I could go to my Show Outline Level drop down. That is now on my toolbar, and I could select level 1. Here we are, my wedding, I could go to level 2. There are my 3 main summaries. And then go to my level 3. And there's my discrete task information. So excellent. I'm going to go ahead and hide this by left-clicking on the column header. And then I will just select delete on my keyboard to hide. The next part of building this schedule is to assign durations. Now, for the purposes of this training, I'm going to put arbitrary durations. However, in your actual schedule building, you'll want to work with your project teams and your subject matter experts who have gone through the processes before and can provide a good estimate of what these activities had taken in the past. So for now, I'm just going to type in some arbitrary numbers. So 1, 1, and notice I'm going to skip the summary task 2, 2, and I'm going to skip this summary task as well, 3 and 3. I skipped the summary task because, as we discussed before, the children always roll up to that parent. So what does that actually mean? If I'm looking at select guests and deliver invitations, I'm showing that it's 1 in 1 day. So a total of 2 days, right? Not necessarily, because what it's actually capturing is the earliest date in your string and the latest date in your string, which usually would be in the first and last activity in that string. Now what we're seeing here is that the date is 9/14 on all of these from start and finish, so the summary will only capture those dates. But if I were to build in logic, it would capture that, and we're going to actually see those changes as we go along. Now that we have our duration set, I'm going to add one last activity, and it's going to be called Wedding Complete. This is actually going to be portrayed as my final milestone. To do that, there's a number of ways I can make this a milestone. And also to demonstrate, I would like to actually bring in our Gantt chart to see visually how it changes. So as you can see right now, they're just showing these bars. Okay, so 1 day bar, 2 day bars, 3 day bars, and then a 1 day bar. Notice when we don't specify a duration, you have these question marks. It's simply asking you to specify that for them. Now to create a milestone in Microsoft Project, all you have to do is change the duration to 0 days. So if I type in 0 and select enter on my keyboard, it'll automatically make my bar of 1 day into a milestone, which is represented with a diamond. Now the next question is, how about this wedding complete activity? Is it really a child to food? The answer is no, it's not a child to food. So what we'll end up doing is outdenting it back to level 2. So to do that, one of 2 ways. I can either highlight the cell that I want and select outdent task, or I can hit Control Z and undo, and I can do the same thing. If I hover over the first 2 letters, I'll be able to move it over to that outline level 2. So now as a quick check, if I go to my outline level 2, I'll see that wedding complete is on there as well. I'm going to go ahead and open everything again by going to my Show Outline drop down and select all subtasks. The next piece of this training is by far the most important in understanding and comprehension of Microsoft Project. We're going to be talking about your 2 most important columns, your predecessor and successor columns. They are the columns where you build out your dependencies for each of your tasks. It's important to note when you build your dependencies, focus only on the children or subtasks, because when you connect a summary task with a dependency, you're actually constraining all the children within that summary to a certain date. So to begin, I want to start with an assumption. The assumption that we're going to have in this schedule is that each of our task activities will occur in chronological order. In other words, select guests will be followed by deliver invitations, and then that completes the guest phase. And then select venue will be followed by hire wedding singer, and that completes the entertainment phase. And then research vendors will be followed by select entrees, which completes the food phase, which will then drive our wedding completion date as well. So to do that, let's understand our predecessors and successor columns. Predecessors are activities that will occur prior to the line item we're referencing, and successors are activities that will occur after the line item that we're referencing. So if we're referencing line item 3, and I'm in my successor column, so in other words, the activity that will come after select guess, what we'll come up with is the number 4, because we're referencing the rows here. So I'm going to type in the number 4 and select enter on my keyboard. And what you can see is automatically the date has been shifted to 9/15/17, which is the day directly after 9/14. This is what we expect to see. Now, I'm going to go into my successor column for row 4, and what row should I enter here as the successor? If you guessed 6, then you'd be correct, because what we're doing is linking up the children tasks. Remember, we're not linking any of the summaries. So we're passing the summaries. The summaries will always roll up what the children have beneath it. So to continue on this path, the successor to row 6 will be row 7, and to row 7 will be row 9. And I'm going to skip down here. From row 9, the successor will be row 10, and then 11 will be the final. Now this is the long way to do this. There's also an alternative method. So what I'll do is I'll select these dependencies and I'll hold Control and Delete on my keyboard and delete them. Now to demonstrate the quicker version, if you know and have that understanding that these are all in chronological order, what you can do is you can select your tasks, hold Control, and continue selecting them, essentially just selecting your children tasks. I can then go to my Task tab and choose Link the selected tasks. And what will it do for me? It will do the same exact thing. It will build out that network just in chronological order, just the same way that we did doing it manually. And if you notice on your right side, when we're building these out, the Gantt chart does in real time update itself to reflect what you have on the data side. So now that we have our dependencies in place, let's take a closer look at the dependency types themselves. There are a total of 4 dependency types. I'll list them out for you. Finish to start, start to start, start to finish, and finish to finish. The first 2 dependency types are the most commonly used and more than likely will be the only ones that you will be using in Microsoft Project. So because of that, I'm only going to be focusing on finish to start and start to start in this training. I'd like to begin by explaining that when you see integers in your predecessor and successor column without a specific dependency type listed after it, in other words, if I come in here and I only see the number 4 without one of the dependency types like FS or SS, then I can assume that it is defaulting to finish to start. The standard in Microsoft Project is finish to start. So the way this reads, when select guest finishes, then deliver invitations can start. That's your finish to start relationship. And the dates follow suit as well. When this finishes, the next one can begin. Now let's take the example that perhaps I want to select guests and deliver the invitations on the same day. So to run these 2 activities in parallel, what I need to do is specify the dependency type of start to start. So I can do that on either my predecessor on row 4 or on my successor on row 3. And the reason I say that is because since they're linked to each other, they'll automatically update on the other end. So let's go ahead and test that. But for me to test that, I will go ahead and type in SS right after the 4 here in my entry bar. Now notice the dates. Currently 9/14 to 9/15. Once I hit enter on my keyboard, I expect the deliver invitations activity to begin on 9/14, the same time as select guest. So let me go ahead and hit enter now. And indeed, here we go. We have these 2 activities occurring in parallel now, which is what our intention was. So now that we have an understanding of the 2 most commonly used dependency types, finish to start and start to start, let's take it one step deeper. We have the ability to create lags and leads in a schedule, and this is the most useful way to create specific dates in your schedule. You may have heard me talking about earlier in this training that a lot of folks like to use constraints to create specific dates in their schedule. It can be very tempting to do. However, there's always a better way, and the best way is through your predecessor and successor columns. So let me demonstrate that. First, what we'll do is we'll remove the dependency type of start to start from this relationship here and default it back to finish to start. The scenario that we're going to consider is, let's pretend that deliver invitations actually should begin on 9/16. There is a 1-day lag in between select guests and deliver invitations. So for us to be able to do that, I can either go into my predecessor column or my successor column, depending on which one I want to use. It doesn't matter. They're both directly connected and will reflect on each other's opposite end. I'll go ahead and type in FS. If I want this to begin on 9/16, I'll have to add a 1-day lag. So to represent that in my network, all I have to do is enter the plus sign and then type the number 1. I don't have to write out day or days. It'll automatically do that for me. So let's hit enter and see if we begin the delivery of invitations on 9/16. And we have a little bit of a surprise. It's on 9/18, but because we know that Saturdays and Sundays are non-working days, we can safely assume that the reason this is on 9/18 instead of the 9/16 that we were planning is because 9/16 is probably on a weekend. Let's verify that by clicking this and seeing what happens. And indeed, here 9/16 is on a Saturday. So to push it to the next working day, 16th is a non-working day, the 17th is a non-working day, and Monday the 18th is the next working day. So indeed, my lag has successfully been implemented in my schedule. So that's a great example of a lag. Let's show an example of a lead. A lead is actually the opposite. So instead of giving additional buffer between your current activity and the one that you're dependent on, you're actually going to take time away. So to demonstrate that, let us go down here to row 10 and select entrees. We'll actually have begin 1 day earlier. To do that, I can come in here into my entry bar and I'll type in FS minus. A lead is denoted with a subtraction symbol as opposed to the addition. So I'll go ahead and enter the number 1. And now my select entrees activity is beginning 1 day earlier than I had previously planned for. So what I've demonstrated here for you is really the nuts and bolts of Microsoft Project. If you want to become an expert and really understand better how networks can be dynamic or be hindered by the way that we schedule, play in these two columns, your successor and predecessor column. This will be the best way for you to learn Microsoft Project. If you're able to master these two columns, you will be a subject matter expert in Microsoft Project. Now that we have our schedule built out, what we can move forward to is the baseline portion of this training. Now, some of you may or may not have heard of an integrated baseline review or an IBR. An IBR is a project management event where all pertinent stakeholders gather at the table and they look at the schedule and determine whether or not it's valid in terms of dependencies, durations, and task activities to successfully complete the project on time. So we're going to pretend that the IBR has just occurred and that we've gotten formal approval to baseline this schedule. To do that, we'll go to the Project tab. We'll head over to the Set Baseline dropdown and select Set Baseline. But before we even set the baseline, let's get a couple of columns up. So we'll actually hit Cancel here, and we'll move our Gantt chart over to the right. We're not going to need it right now. I'm going to overwrite a couple of columns by double left clicking on the header. So to overwrite predecessor, I can double left click and type in baseline start. And I'm going to overwrite the successor column with baseline finish. And I'll go ahead and hide these two for now by highlighting the columns in their entirety and selecting delete on my keyboard. You will notice in Microsoft Project there's a total of 11 standard baselines that you can choose from. I'm going to start on the baseline start and baseline finish without a number associated with it. So when we go back to our set baseline option, you'll notice we have a radio button for set baseline as a default here, and then you have your 11 options. Because we chose the baselines without a number, that will be the baseline that we select here. And we're going to leave it at the radio button for entire project and select OK. What you'll notice when we hit OK, our baseline start and baseline finish dates will change from NA to new dates. So let's see that occur. I hit OK here, and here are our dates. Now you may be wondering, where did those baseline dates come from? Well, very simple actually. Microsoft Project, when you baseline, takes a snapshot of your start column and copies it into your baseline start column or baseline column of your choosing. And it also copies your finish dates into your baseline finish dates. This is the first portion of your baseline. And the benefit of the baseline is to gauge variance from it. So how can we gauge a variance when we haven't actually updated the schedule? Well, the answer is you wouldn't be able to. The first step to getting value out of a baseline is to actually have changes occur in your schedule. So we'll go ahead and demonstrate some changes by creating updates in the schedule. To do that, let's bring in the percent complete column. What I'll do is, in between task mode and task name, I'll add the percent complete column. So to do that, I'll right click on the task name column, as when I right click on a header, the column that I insert will end up to the left of the header that I've clicked on. So to do it between these two, I'll right click the task name and then insert column. The column I'll bring in is the percent complete, not the percent work complete. Just percent complete. And notice it'll take the same width as the column that you hover over when you insert that column. So I'll go ahead and minimize this to a smaller width. Now I have my percent complete column visible. What I'll begin with is to update my status date. We go into further detail in Microsoft Project 201 on how to use the status date. For the purposes of this training, the status date is simply to tell Microsoft Project what today is, as opposed to it defaulting to the system date. So we're going to pretend that today is September 25th. And we'll hit OK there. Assuming that today is September 25th, we can already assume that there's going to be a number of updates required to be made on this schedule. Because if we look at the dates, it looks like we should be complete through row 7, hiring the wedding singer. We should have completed the guest and the entertainment phases based off these dates that we have here. And because it's the 25th, we should actually begin research vendors. Now these are just arbitrary assumptions based off the status date that I've selected for this example. We're simply going to go to the task activities, not the summary task, because if you recall, task activities will always roll up to their parent task. So we'll come in here and I'm going to pretend that this is 100% complete. My deliver invitations, I'm actually going to pretend that this, instead of 1 day, took us 3 days. Let's pretend that our select venue, instead of 2 days, actually took 5 days. And let's pretend that research vendors, instead of taking 3 days, actually took 9 days. Now what you saw as I made these changes are the light blue impacted activities. So anything that changes in your schedule will turn that light blue to indicate, hey, this has changed based off that last edit that you made. Now what's nice is that our start and finish columns stay live in the sense that they're always shifting, but my baseline start and baseline finish columns have stayed the same. You may be wondering why they stayed the same, and the reason is because we're going to be able to derive a variance or a delta from our baseline and what the actual finish is. So for us to be able to gain this variance from the finish date, we can add a new column. We're going to call this column finish variance. The finish variance column can be extremely useful if you don't like to do subtraction. What it does for you out of the box is it will take the delta between your baseline finish, which was your planned finish date, and your actual finish date here. So between 9/14 and 9/14 there was no variance. However, when we got to the deliver invitations, we started adding duration here. This was originally 1 day and has switched over to 3 days. So it was a 2-day variance. And Microsoft Project is cumulative in nature when it comes to the finished variance, because it will take the cumulative value between the original push, the original delta in variance, and add it on to the continued variance. So we didn't add 5 days of variance here, we only added a few days. And we didn't add 11 days of variance in here, we only added something like 6 days. So now that we've gone through the baseline portion of this training, we can come to the conclusion with producing a PDF report. Many folks don't have Microsoft projects, so the best way to distribute information from a project schedule is through a PDF report. To do that, it's very simple. It's just like you would do in a Microsoft Word or Microsoft Excel or PowerPoint. It's simply going to the File menu, going to Print, and this is now your print preview screen. Now you may not see anything when you first arrive here. There should be a link here saying Enable Print Preview. You can go ahead and click that and you'll see this preview. I typically recommend to use tabloid instead of 8.5 by 11, as you generally tend to get more information from your schedule into the PDF report. So if I switch over to 11 by 17 here, I can see more stuff. Of course, I'll have the ability to go into the page setup. Within the page setup, I can change the header. I can change the footer, I can change the legend, the margins, and the page, and pretty much everything that you want to. You can modify in here. So when I'm done tinkering with those settings, I can go over to Save As. I'll browse for a location, and I'll change my Save As type to PDF and name it Wedding Sample, and I'll save. And I'll hit OK. So when I go back to my PDF and open it, it looks a little something like this. Now this was a very quick and easy way to make a PDF report. Some folks do like to see that Gantt chart show up. So to get that Gantt chart on to the PDF, all you have to do is go back to your Microsoft Project file and hover over. Remember, you can hover over the middle part of this and get that double-sided line with two arrows pointing in opposite directions. I can then drag and drop this wherever I want. If I bring in any of this Gantt chart into my view here, it will show up on my PDF report. So if I go to Print Preview, which I have a shortcut there, there is my Gantt chart, and it can be included as part of your report. So if I go back to Save, and I go to my location, find my PDF report, here's my wedding sample, I'll save, and yes, I'm going to replace it. I'm going to overwrite it. And I'll hit OK. When I open up that file, sure enough, there's my Gantt chart. So with that, we conclude our Microsoft Project 101 training. This has been an exciting workshop for me, and I hope that you have gained some more knowledge on Microsoft Project. Please, as a reminder, check your Microsoft Project 101 training packet, as on the back side of that syllabus you will find an assignment. This assignment allows you to check any knowledge gaps that you have with this training. And as always, please feel free to reach out to anyone on the SDD Scheduling Team for assistance in Microsoft Project and other scheduling needs.